It is the second week of Peachtober and I've come up with a rough idea for the second illustration I'm going to be doing for this week. And I know I said I'm going to be doing characters as well as animals, but with the prompts I had, I just couldn't miss on doing a whale. So now that I've got this draft done, I'm going to be doing the finished sketch on the watercolour paper ready for inking and then watercolour. So I'll take you along for the process of that and I'll explain a little bit about how this idea came together. Hello and welcome to a new voiceover. I hope that you're doing well, especially with the changing of the seasons at the moment and with it getting colder if you're in the northern hemisphere. I've been having an interesting time, let's just put it that way, with the changing in temperature. I'm sure a lot of other spoonies can probably relate to the spring and autumn changes in weather and how it can affect us, but I digress. With the sketch that you can see me doing here, I am transferring over the rough sketch to the watercolour paper and I'm using a clutch pencil for this. I'm using the body of the clutch pencil is a Koh-i-Noor clutch pencil and inside is Mitsubishi HB 2mm lead. It's the only Mitsubishi 2mm HB that I have. I have a pack of the 4B and I bought a clutch pencil from Mitsubishi to hold those, and when I got the Mitsubishi pencil it came with a HB lead inside, and honestly I'm kind of kicking myself a little bit that I didn't pick up HB because I've actually been really enjoying this HB lead. It's the perfect softness versus hardness for certain applications, including when I'm transferring a sketch onto my watercolor paper. It's not too soft and it's not too hard for what I need, and it's been working out well for this challenge so far. Speaking of the challenge, I should probably go over how I came up with this idea. It started with me looking through the prompts for this week, and I knew with crater that I probably wanted to do something with the moon and the moon having craters, so I knew I wanted to include the moon. I knew that blue interested me and also dream, so I was thinking of blue. I was brainstorming different ideas. Of course, there's the obvious one of using a blue color scheme, but then I was thinking, well, what about things that are blue or have the name blue? And that's when I brainstormed different animals and came to the blue whale. And it was kind of just a spur of the moment pop of inspiration. I was like, well, one of the words for this week is dream. So what is the dream meaning of a whale, or a dream meaning of a blue whale specifically? So I did a quick Google and read through a bunch of websites, and one thing that kind of seemed the common theme for the dream meaning of a blue whale is overcoming obstacles. So after that, I was like, okay, well, if I'm incorporating dream as in dream meaning, what other things have the same dream meaning of overcoming obstacles? And that was when I found other things by looking up flower meanings. I do like to include symbolism, and I want to include symbolism more in things that I do. And one thing that always interested me was the meanings that people have given to flowers in different cultures. So I looked up different flowers that have the meaning of overcoming obstacles, and there are actually quite a few. So I could pick from quite a number of different ones, but one of the flowers that came up with the dream meaning of overcoming obstacles was roses. And again, in kind of like a spur of the moment pop of inspiration. I was like, Google moon rose, because I was including moon. I knew I was including, or I thought I was including maybe blue whale. And now I wanted to include other things that have the same meaning as the blue whale. So I was thinking, how could I tie all of this back to the moon? So I Googled moon rose, and that was when I came across the blue moon rose, which is a blue lilac leaning rose. And I ended up going a little bit more darker and saturated than what blue moon roses actually look like. But I thought that that was kind of funny that all of this came together in a very inspired moment. I just started brainstorming, and then it went whale, dream meaning, flowers, flowers with that dream meaning, roses, and then moon rose, blue moon rose. It was very like one thing after another and just letting things flow. And it was a really, really fun time. Once I had all of these different ideas, I then needed to figure out how to combine them. So I went to do a bunch of thumbnailing and then eventually rough sketching, which led to the rough sketch that I showed you at the beginning of this video. And all I really knew going into the thumbnailing was that I wanted to have the whale flying, swimming in front of the moon, and I wanted it to be very whimsical and dreamlike. I wanted it to kind of not really make logical sense and have that also be an element of the dream prompt. And I wanted to have a flow of the roses coming down over and around the moon as well. And I played around with a few different things and ended up settling on this idea. When recording me transferring the sketch onto the watercolour paper, I sped up the process as a time lapse, but I kept the inking sections here real time because someone mentioned last week in the comments that they enjoyed that I left it real time, so I thought I'd leave it real time again this week. Thank you for commenting about that, by the way. I hope that it gives you a better understanding of how this pen works and its line variation. I have noticed a few differences with some of the other pens compared to this pen when it comes to the pressure I have to use, its sensitivity, and the angles and pressure I've got to use for very thin lines and things like that. I am planning on still making a video on this pen and my other inking pens, why I've started using this pen, and things like that as well. And I do also want to, in that video, discuss how this pen manages to deal with all of these illustrations I'm going to be doing for Peachtober, and if it can handle being used relatively frequently on watercolor paper, because even though this is hot press, I do find that the slight texture of cotton paper does wear down nibs a lot faster than smooth paper that you use in, like, say, a sketchbook. So I want that to also be a consideration in the video that I do after Peachtober about this pen as well. When it came to deciding on a color scheme for this illustration, I knew I wanted to have some kind of cohesion with the color when it came to all three elements of the illustration. I didn't want them to all just be kind of plonked onto each other and feel too separate. I wanted to have something that brought all three of them together with the color. And I thought of a few different ways of doing this. One was through using a similar or the same color note through all three. One was to use the same texture through all three. And then another was to include color elements where two of the elements have the same color and then two other overlapping elements have a second color and things like that, so that I can kind of bring all three elements together. And I ended up settling on a few different ways of doing this. With the texture, I settled on using a couple granulating pigments that ended up being either in two of the elements or in all three. I used viridian and ultramarine mainly for this, but I did also include some cerulean chromium as well. I used the viridian mainly in the moon and the whale, the ultramarine in the whale and the roses, and the cerulean chromium in the whale and the roses, but mainly in the whale. So I have this kind of undercurrent of granulating pigments popping up in all three with overlaps between the elements, like having the viridian in the moon and the whale, or the ultramarine in the roses and the whale. You can see elements pop up. You can see colours pop up, sorry, in each of the three elements, and that kind of brings them together a little bit more. Along the same vein, when it came to the colours and pigments themselves, I was trying to overlap where they were being used and to have a small selection of pigments in my mixes to bring some more cohesion. And that was true of both the granulating pigments that I've mentioned already, the viridian, the ultramarine, etc., but also with the non-granulating pigments as well. I kept an overlap between each of the three elements. For example, with the roses, I was using mainly purples, pinks, and blues. And I was using, for the pink and purple mixtures, I was using PV19. For the moon, I created a mix that was almost like a homebrew version of Moonglow. I mixed together PV19, the Viridian, which I believe is PG18 off the top of my head, and I also mixed in Bloodstone, and the Bloodstone is different from actual Moonglow. Together, that meant that I had a very heavy granulating neutral that split into areas of slight pink and slight green. And that meant that I had this bridge between the whale and the roses, because the moon had pink elements from the roses and then the viridian green elements from the whale in it, bridging the three pieces together. When painting the moon, I started with just some fresh clear water and I wet the whole surface of the moon in order to get the paper nice and wet to make some wet and wet blends. And then I mixed together that homebrew moon glow that I was mentioning earlier, the PV19, the viridian, and the bloodstone, which you can see me mixing off to the side here. I do dip into the viridian frequently because I wanted to make sure that that really popped through quite a bit in the surface of the moon. And I wanted to make sure that this was a really nice wet and wet blend. I wanted there to be some areas that still went to the white of the paper. And after this layer dried, I went in with a wet on dry layer where I darkened up some of the craters with a very similar mix to this, but a little bit more heavy on the bloodstone, a little bit more neutral. And in a moment, I will do a little close up so you can see some of the granulation as it's drying. I do find that this kind of mixture tends to granulate a lot more as it dries, and you can end up getting quite a shift from when you first put the pigment down to when it's finally drying. I will say that when I finished painting the moon, I was initially a little bit worried because I didn't have any context around it. The roses were still the white of the paper, the whale was still the white of the paper. So everything I'd painted on the moon, the heavy granulation, the colours I'd chosen, stood out very, very starkly. And it was a case of having to trust the process and recognizing that there was a lot of contrast and there wasn't any context, and to just hope that once I'd provided that context with the roses being painted in and the whale being painted in, that it would all end up coming together and making sense. Because no one really looks up at the moon and goes, yes, that is very green. So it was it was very much a case of trusting the process. Speaking of the process, the roses definitely took the longest to paint overall and had the most layers to them as well. I spent a long time building up layers and building up different colour variations, and then also making sure to have different edges as well. On some of the washes, I had some hard and soft edges, and then I also repeated this hard and soft edge in the final layer on the whale as well. And that was just another textural element that I wanted to experiment a little bit with this illustration. When it comes to the challenge itself, this week did end up coming across roadblocks, and kind of inevitably it was health roadblocks. I knew this would probably happen, which is why I designed the way that I'm doing Peachtober the way I've done it, with it being weekly rather than daily. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll pop it up in the cards for you, how I was planning to do this art challenge and how I've modified it from the original challenge. And this week definitely ended up taking a little bit longer than I had planned, and I couldn't really paint for a few days because of what ended up happening. And I'm fine now, as you can probably tell. I was able to start painting again yesterday, and I finished off the rest of it today. So I did all of the painting that you can see in multiple sessions over 2 days. And the brush pen inking, I'm not sure how many sessions I did for that, but I had to basically do it in small bite-sized chunks, and that's also why you'll see different lighting as well. At one point I have very, very dramatic lighting, and that's because I was filming quite early in the morning when the sun shines really, really brightly through one of my windows. And that was only a small painting chunk, and then I just had to take advantage of the time and energy and things that I had when I had it, and to make sure to rest in between and also get all the other life tasks done as well in between too, and make sure I have the energy for that as well. At the moment, I'm still planning on doing 5 illustrations for Peachtober. If, however, anything ends up coming up or I feel it's necessary for my own well-being, then I'm going to do 4. But at the moment, I'm still planning on doing 5, and fingers crossed I can keep on chugging away at doing that. I'll be getting on with coming up with ideas for week 3 next and thumbnailing for that. If you are participating in Peachtober or any of the other challenges, let me know how that's going in the comments. I'm cheering you all on no matter how much you are doing, and I hope that you're having fun most of all. On top of everything else, I just hope that you're having fun with it. I really enjoyed this week's illustration, and I'm super happy with how it came out. I learnt a lot from it, and I hope to take that into future pieces. And thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!